Mentis Wave has got a new one. Why China is not an example of communist or socialist success. And this one looks good as well. Going to save that in a tab. We'll get to it. Anyways, Mentis Wave video. Let's go. CCP has boasted about having lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. However, they were only able to do this because hundreds of millions of people have been living in poverty under its rule. Antonio Gachefo.
Hey internets, there has been a very interesting narrative that has gained a little bit of extra traction in the last 5 years or so. And this is for socialists to claim that the Chinese Communist Party, or China in general, is an example of successful socialism. And you'll find this throughout the internet. If you go on Blue Sky, you'll see them saying this. Or if you go to those socialist subreddits, which there's quite a lot of them actually, you'll see people saying this. Or heck, I even see some of those MAGA communist types saying this. And indeed, on a very simplistic surface level, if you look at China, there does seem to be some evidence of success. They are indeed run by a Chinese Communist Party, and chances are good that they have been run by said party throughout all of your lifetime. And of course, there does seem to be some wins to their name. China is number 2 in nominal GDP as of the making of this video. China was also in the top 20
They're probably fudging those
in
numbers.
terms of growth from 1980 to 2010.
They're probably fudging those numbers.
The Chinese people have also enjoyed a very noticeable increase to their quality of life in the last 20 years. And plus,
They're probably fudging those numbers.
It's really hard to deny just how beautiful the Chinese skyline is at night. I mean, seriously, just look at it. It's not bad at all.
Not sure what happened with the video there. I mean, it looks cool. You just sort of hope and pray it's not a bunch of tofu construction. Otherwise, those skyscrapers are going to be falling down fairly quickly.
Kind of makes you want to visit there. A lot of those major Chinese cities really do look pretty darn good. And indeed, there's tons of videos out there on YouTube you can find of people visiting Chinese hotels and being blown away by them. So I guess that's it then. The socialists finally did it, and all of us crazy free marketeer libertarians, well, it looks like we were just plain wrong. Or perhaps not. Or actually, not at all. Not anywhere near close. Yeah, in this video, I'm going to be explaining why this claim from various internet socialists that the Chinese Communist Party has created successful socialism is nothing more than pure 100% unfiltered cope. And I mean maximum copium straight from the copioid factory. Because when you take a more in-depth look at things, you'll realize that the Chinese Communist Party has not achieved communism, has largely reversed most of its socialist policies since the mid-1970s, and has been relatively unsuccessful. In fact, the overwhelming majority of all Chinese wins in the last 50 years can be attributed to factors outside the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP as they're sometimes called. Rather, the CCP is actually responsible for most of China's problems, as they are guilty of numerous sins. Sins including genocide, oppression of their own people, forced organ harvesting of political dissenters, political repression, completely unnecessary market regulations, severe government corruption, sometimes near total suppression of free speech, no real free press, so to speak.
I mean, you still can't call Xi Jinping Winnie the Pooh, even though he's fat and does look an awful lot like Winnie the Pooh.
Religious persecution, as well as spying on their own citizens and people abroad even, with the usual extensive internet censorship, where they actually will punish their own citizens for just criticizing the CCP. Which, speaking of bad actors spying on what you're doing online, this video's sponsor is private internet access. A lot of people unfortunately still don't quite understand why you need a VPN while using the internet. And it's often the same old fallacy of thinking that if you aren't doing anything wrong, then you don't need privacy. Yeah, no. This mentality will trap you in the mindset
that's caved-in
head
brain thinking.
For government and hackers to be able to effectively stand behind your back and watch everything you are doing. The reality is, whether it's those hackers trying to steal your identity, your credit cards, your passwords, and other personal data, or the surveillance state or copyright trolls, a VPN remains the best way to protect yourself from these problems at a cost that is
more
significantly
intellectual
less than the
property,
danger of
bro.
using the internet
Fuck
unprotected.
intellectual
Private
property.
internet access solves the problem for you by using RAM-only, no-log servers and top-of-the-line encryption to mask your IP online and stop potential bad actors from stealing your info. Not only are they a top-quality VPN, but their app is stable, user-friendly, and available on all of your devices without limitations. PIA also comes with excellent downloading and upload speeds, tons of security features, and one particular favorite is that it is very streamer-friendly. They have servers all over the world you can choose from, and many of them are optimized for Netflix,
Sweet.
Hulu, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, Disney and Paramount Plus, etc., etc. And you can use PIA to unlock the geo-restricted content on streaming services, allowing you access to a much wider variety of movies and TV shows. It is also very affordable. If you use my personal link in the description below, you can get private internet access now for 83% off at only $2.03 per month, plus 4 months free, and all covered with a 30-day money-back, risk-free guarantee. Seriously, it's a good VPN, get it. Anyways, to truly understand why the Chinese Communist Party, or again the CCP, is not in any way responsible for the vast majority of any of the successes that any of the Chinese have had in the last 100 years or so, you first need to get a quick rundown of the history. The CCP was first founded in the early 1920s, but like most communist parties, they kind of started out as a mostly milquetoast intellectual party that focused more on their universities. However, that's actually a pretty good strategy, and so they did start to slowly gain power, mainly leading up to the rise of Mao Zedong. Now, Mao was not one of the core leading founders of the CCP.
No, he was actually a rather fledgling, obscure figure that took advantage of certain power vacuums and really just manipulated his way to the top. He wasn't anyone special.
He's just the most famous because he oversaw the CCP's transition from a simple political party to the leading party in control of the Chinese government, as he is the man that is often seen as responsible for the victory of the Chinese Communist Revolution, and the dominance of the People's Liberation Army from October 1947 to effectively now. However, Mao Zedong was an interesting man. He can be considered half an intellectual and half a military leader. To again keep things short, this unfortunately may be the reason many of his ideas and practices can be considered quite cruel and evil. He adopted a style of Marxist-Leninist theory mixed with Chinese thought, partially from the early CCP intellectuals and part his own vision of a Chinese future. Mainly, he believed very strongly in violence as a way to gain favor and control, with a heavy emphasis in the ends justify the means mentality.
Yeah, he's the one who came up with the phrase "power comes from the barrel of a gun."
For example, he would publicly torture and execute landlords to gain control of an area, regardless of whether or not they had done anything wrong, and then he would promise his plunder to the peasants simply as a way of getting them on his side. He would also torture and murder random people to gain false confessions, which he would then use to justify more power grabs, often against his own party. So even other members of the CCP, accusing those he viewed as getting in his way of gaining power as being counter-revolutionaries, regardless of any real evidence. It was all just consequentialist and him gaining power, so this can be most easily understood as a rule by fear strategy. As the CCP became the dominant political party post-World War II, Mao secured his position as the leader through effectively implying by action that anyone who opposed him would be labeled and then imprisoned or killed without outright stating it. And so then the obvious question about Mao becomes, or the Mao question as we'll call it, is did the ends justify the means? Well, if by the ends in terms of Mao's personal status, he did manage to stay in power quite a long time, but if by the ends we're talking in terms of being good for the long-term well-being of the Chinese people, well, obviously and very absolutely not. Mao Zedong's reign stands as a textbook historical example of communist failure. His Great Leap Forward policies managed to somehow be an even worse version of previous Marxist-Leninist collectivization stupidity, because Mao believed he could industrialize the nation without sacrificing farm output by collectivizing the farms, despite the fact that farm collectivization had already proved to be a failed policy idea decades prior in the Soviet Union. Which is sad, but also very interesting, because a very common commie cope about the Soviet famines, at least, is that famines were just more common back then, so, you know, it was just bad luck or something. Yeah, pure cope. But then here was Mao experiencing the same fail in the late 50s to late 60s, when famines were far less common. Estimated death toll of the tale of Chairman Mao and yet another farm collectivization fail, 15 to 55 million. So very much not good. Next, Mao's Cultural Revolution was little more than purging the Chinese people of their heritage for no real reason other than it was allegedly associated with lay capitalism and therefore lay bad. What it did in practice was just shut down businesses and schools while persecuting any intellectual or artist deemed to be associated with said lay bad, lay capitalist culture.
Yeah, they basically eliminated all of their heritage under the guise of lay capitalism, lay bad. But really, when you eliminate those sort of roots for people of culture, heritage, tradition, identity, when you do that, you actually have a more pliant and compliant population. And that's what he was really aiming for.
Ultimately screwing over skilled workers, you know, the people you kind of need for an economy to function or advance. And then there was also the general issues of unrealistic quotas into the Chinese economy under Mao. One of the biggest problems with communism is that it tries to centrally plan economic output that would, in a privatized system, be handled by incentives. To try and get around this, a communist regime will often use quotas to incentivize people to act instead. This is because there's a kind of a problem here. To get someone to do something for you, the only two consistent ways anyways are to either reward them or to punish them. And because the rewards that come with privatization under capitalist economics are deemed in this system to be les bad, this means communist regimes in practice must threaten those who fail to meet their quotas. And then when those quotas make little to no sense whatsoever, which considering the knowledge problem of central planning, they generally often do, since communism destroys the very thing that allows an economy to have any way to know what a realistic quota even means in the first.
Yeah, what a shocker. Central planners had no idea how to manage a farm. Probably because a lot of them weren't farmers.
Place. The result is that the people who are forced to live in this kind of system are forced to do these really weird, extremely irrational things, like melting down their tools for steel in order to meet unrealistic steel quotas, or falsely accusing their neighbors of cattle theft in order to avoid punishment for impossible grain quotas, or other false accusations or other bizarre excuses that ultimately resulted in very low trust society. And then for the grain and other goods that were produced, where they were allocated was wrought with inefficiency and poor planning, usually resulting in more resources being put into cities while the rural peasants starved to death. Yeah, so much for that lie that the peasants were sold during the communist revolution, that they would be the ones in charge and that they would be the ones owning the land. The result of all these failures is that China under Mao enjoyed an almost near zero economic growth. In fact, around the time that Mao Zedong died in 1976 and thus was no longer chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, global poverty was estimated around 1.5 to 2 billion, with the number of Chinese in that poverty bucket being somewhere around 700 to 800 million. In other words, Mao's economy was such an epic and colossally pathetic failure that roughly half of all global poverty existed purely in China. Which then brings us to the first major commie cope that needs to be refuted in regards to China being allegedly successful socialism or successful communism or whatever. Which is one I actually already covered a long time ago in my video on the Gravel Institute. From the late 70s to the early 1990s, China was the country that had the greatest reduction in overall global poverty, and leftoids, alongside the Chinese Communist Party propaganda division, will cite this as proof of socialist success, which of course is completely insane for two very simple reasons. The first of which is of course the fact that China would be the only country that could reduce most of global poverty at that time, because half the global poverty was in China. So it's a very, very weird thing to brag about. It's like a person with a 20-foot high, 5-ton pile of trash in their backyard who finally gets down to cleaning it, then bragging that they were the one in the neighborhood who cleaned up the most trash. I mean, yeah, sure,
so they're the ones who made
very
it.
Pedantically, yes, congratulations to you, I guess. But of course, on a rational, realistic point of view, this is a very, very stupid argument to make. And the second reason is, of course, the question of how China managed to reduce so much poverty in their country. Because back then, China had a poverty rate of over 80%. And today, in 2025, using the same World Bank data system, the Chinese poverty rate is now under 1%. So yeah, it's a pretty big cleanup, but again, a very big pile of trash. So how did they do it? Well, here's the thing, they did it by reversing most of their socialist policies. Under Mao, things like privatization of farms, for example, and industrialization was effectively banned. And so while the CCP was still in charge and still the dominant governing authority of China, they started to be communist effectively in name only. So for example, the HRS allowed farmers to lease land and then sell their surplus produce in markets, thus allowing effective privatization of the agricultural industry. And so Mao's collectivist policy was effectively dismantled around 1978. The CCP then allowed private businesses in rural areas to operate again, which had a result of, to no one's surprise, returning trade and manufacturing to the area. The CCP also had a bunch of what you'd call state-owned enterprises, which they then started to privatize in the 90s. And this pattern just kind of went on and on. They started allowing foreign investments, started reducing taxes, adding tax incentives for even less taxes, and they also started adopting kind of strategies that you see in more neoliberal countries. So for instance, using the taxes gained from the newly privatized industry, and then using those taxes to fund education and infrastructure, which is effectively the same thing that the United States does, even though the United States is historically and generally considered to be a capitalist country. When you look at things a bit more in depth and what China has done in the last 40 years or so, they've actually adopted similar strategies as what the United States adopted with the New Deal. In other words, adopting a mixed market economy. This then brings us to the next commie-cope to be refuted. Yes, Reddit communists will unironically try to argue that communism is compatible with the free market. I wish I was joking. Now, to be honest, this is one case where it's really hard to tell the difference between the useful idiot communists and the unironically evil communists who are lying and know that they're lying. This is one of those things that can definitely just be a case of pure gaslighting. But it's common enough of a cope that it does need to be refuted. No, communism and socialism does not allow for a free market. This argument can only be made by equivocating on the definition of socialism and capitalism. And so this refutation has a long answer and a short answer. The long answer is that you should go read Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, and you will immediately gain a very in-depth understanding as to how insane this argument is. But of course, you're watching a video with the entire purpose being that you don't have to read a bunch of books to figure out these things. So here's a quick rundown.
Read a book? Who has time for that?
All systems of economies can be broken down into two archetypes, socialism and capitalism. And all those economic systems can effectively be explained as combinations of those two types. Socialism being collective control of the means of production, which thus necessitates the interference of private individual property rights and the free exchange of goods and services, and capitalism being the system characterized by the private ownership of the means of production and not interfering with any kind of free exchange. And so when a communist says that you can have a free market and communism, well, that's not actually true, at least not to any kind of meaningful extent. I mean, sure, there is such a thing as market socialism, but that's just an example of a mixture of the two systems. They're not a binary. They're just different directions that an economy can go, and pretty much every single country is a mixture of the two in one way or another. And this just all kind of brings you to the question, okay, well, how do you understand whether or not an improvement of an economy was done by socialism or capitalism? And well, that's again by understanding things more in terms of what is a socialist policy and what is a capitalist policy, based on understanding what socialism and capitalism is and what the direction is, and how these differences tend to move things along in said directions. This can be a little bit complicated, so a simpler way to look at it is just pushing it to its logical conclusion. And so in the case of them claiming that communism is compatible with the free market, we can just ask ourselves a really obvious question, which is, could a 100% capitalist economy have a free market, thus allowing the totally free exchange of goods and services with private ownership? And the answer is yes, it absolutely could. It's literally the definition. And then could a communist system characterized by the collective owns of the means of production, which necessitates the interference of the free exchange of goods and services, could a 100% communist system that requires the collective to stamp its approval on everything before the exchange happens have a free market? No, it couldn't. The entire point of communism is under the claim that privatization is a lay-bad hierarchy, and thus it is justified to interfere with it, which means the market isn't free. And so market socialism is just when socialists allow enough capitalism that they can have a market, which is exactly what China did. In fact, if anything, and this is kind of an interesting thing that most people don't point out, China,
under Xi Jinping, they started to roll a lot of that back.
in some ways went even harder on capitalism, and in some ways is even more towards capitalist policies than the United States is. And you might be wondering, well, what the heck could I possibly be talking about? And the answer to that is actually patents and so-called IP rights. Patents and IP focus on goods and services that aren't actually scarce resources. And thus, in order to enforce patents and IP, you actually need to interfere with the free market, because there's no actual material good or service. This kind of lies between the distinction of copying and theft. If you had the magic ability to copy your neighbor's food, that doesn't mean that your neighbor no longer has their food, which means that magical ability would allow you to copy your neighbor's food without interfering with your neighbor's desire of how to use their food. It wouldn't interfere with your neighbor's ability to then trade their food. On the flip side, the only way to stop this magical copying ability is to interfere with the magician's ability to freely exchange their goods and services. This is actually an interesting thing a lot of people don't realize, which is that IP rights and patents are actually socialist policies. And the Chinese Communist Party, well, what they do is they allow privatized industries to have much looser restrictions in terms of IP rights and patents, especially when it comes to overseas IP and patents. And this is one of the
they really could give two shits about intellectual property. Chinese have proven time and again they will steal it if it benefits them.
biggest things that allows China to create so many cheap alternative products, which can then be exported to the global market, because the CCP actually has a much more free market approach to IP and patents and whatnot on various inventions around the world, thus allowing for a plethora of cheap Chinese copy products. And this is just a simple example as to why, for people to fully understand these things, you really have to look at it in terms of understanding socialist policies and what the difference is between them and a capitalist policy. And that will allow you to better track whether or not a policy was successful or not, rather than just looking at, oh, well, this country calls themselves communist and they've had a much greater level of success in the last 40 years, therefore communism actually works. Well, no, that's actually a very stupid way of looking at things. Someone can call themselves anything. That doesn't
But it
objectively
says
change
communism
what
in
they
the
are. And that, I
name.
think, is where a lot of these communist copes come from in terms of the CCP, because technically the CCP is still in charge of China, is still the governing authority of China, but an objective look at their policies
For now, at
that
least.
came in line with China reducing their poverty level can all be traced to capitalist policies. Every time the CCP steps out of the way of its people and allows them to have private ownership and stops interfering with their daily lives and stops interfering with the free exchange of goods and services, the Chinese people are better off. Now, this all alone is enough to explain
they really
why
are.
claiming that China
Well,
is
for the most
successful
part.
and therefore communism is successful is not a good argument. But there's still quite a few more copes out there that really need to be shot down. I'll start with
There are certain cultural issues with the Chinese that need to be addressed. And I don't know if... I'm really not sure what the solution is with that sort of thing. Whether it's the heavy hand of government or removing the heavy hand of government. I'm not sure, but there are certain cultural problems in China that need to be addressed if they are to sustain themselves and survive.
with this one, which is the claim that the reason China is successful is because in China, capital is the political power. So in other words, they're pointing out the fact that billionaires in the United States have a lot of say due to things like lobbying and the revolving door and such. And like all midwit takes, it is, of course, pedantically correct. Yes, the United States is a lot more corrupt than they let on, but that doesn't tell you anything about capitalism unless your definition of capitalism is when the government does stuff, or that the government is corrupt and the solution is more government, which is effectively what they're trying to say here. In some ways, this is just another example of not understanding
Bernie bros
the
be like,
difference between
what?
socialism and capitalism, but the main thing they're not understanding here is the existence of the non-productive class. Centralized authority, the main thing that makes it a socialist policy is that it's able to take money away from people in a non-voluntary manner, like for example taxation, and then they're able to spend those resources however they see fit, despite not actually engaging in anything that can be considered capitalism in order to earn those resources. Hence, they are non-productive. They didn't produce that resource from the free market or free exchange of goods or services. They gained it through theft. This is what the government and a thief have in common. And government corruption, well, that's just large businesses looking at what the government does and correctly identifying what it is, and them wanting to get in on being a member of the non-productive class. And yes, to some degree, the large corporations can be seen as guilty of wrongdoing when getting involved in this, but when it comes to hiring a hitman, for example, to put this in easier terms to understand, well, both the hitman and the guy hiring the hitman are in the wrong. And the solution to the problem of the hitman is definitely not giving more weapons to the hitman. That's not how you solve the problem. In fact, and interestingly enough, the only real difference between the United States government and the Chinese government in this instance is that the CCP is actually slightly more honest. Privatization in China allows for private ownership, but still maintains levels of state control. And so the non-productive class still controls how the government functions and what they do in China. It's just that the United States government likes to pretend that the same thing is capitalism, or just kind of sweep it in under the rug, whereas the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, does the opposite. They're like, oh yeah, we totally own all of these things. We're totally communist. It's all centrally planned, even though they're really not. In both instances, both of them have corruption. Chinese politicians and United States politicians are both accepting bribes out the wazoo. They just call their bribes different things and use different forms of propaganda to hide it. For example, going back earlier in this video when I mentioned all the bad things that the Chinese government was doing before getting into the gameplay part of this video. Those are all things that actually the modern CCP is doing. For instance, going a bit more in depth into the rule of the princelings. The descendants of senior Chinese Communist Party leaders regularly abuse their families' connections and positions of power in order to gain high-ranking positions in either politics or the military or largely in private businesses, especially with the state-owned enterprises. And And whenever a business is being newly privatized, it's often a princeling that will be given control of it. And so that just kind of highlights how silly it is to use China as an example against United States government corruption. China is actually one of the simplest pieces of empirical evidence that we have that the solution to government corruption is definitely not more government, because you end up with the same corruption, it's just more directly tied to top political families. So the difference here is that with American-style corruption, you have mega corporations bribing the state for legislation that is favorable to them at the expense of the rest of the economy. And on the other hand, with CCP-style corruption, you have a state-owned enterprise that has been privatized, but still owned by CCP family members, while the CCP passes legislation that is favorable to them at the expense of the rest of the economy. Somehow, in Tanky's smooth brains, the former is considered the evil capitalism, while the latter is considered a communist win. It's absolutely ridiculous. These are the kinds of low IQ takes that a person has when they have absolutely no understanding or comprehension of power dynamics whatsoever. And honestly, going through a lot of commie posts about this, a lot of commie copes, is that I've noticed a lot of them just really have dichotomy.
Terminal dichotomy.
I've seen this in a
brain.
few people, especially since starting my channel. People see corruption in the West, and yes, that corruption definitely exists, but then they get this kind of faulty assumption that because the West is corrupt, then that means non-Western nations and non-Western governments must not be corrupt. So, for instance, they'll realize
No,
that
they
CNN
are
and
corrupt.
MSNBC
The only difference is, depending on which nation you go to, you might actually be able to buy in on the corruption. There's always going to be corruption no matter where you go. It's just a matter of what type of corruption and whether or not the buy-in is low enough that you can get in on the game.
in basically the entire United States mainstream media elite, they'll realize that they're pushing nonsense, but then they'll just go off to RT, Russia Today, and guzzle down their propaganda like it's no tomorrow. They completely fail to realize that it's the same crappy journo spin jobs, just for a different power structure. So, for example, a lot of these Chinese apologist subreddits like Reddit/Jen Zedong, it's not just the CCP they worship. They even assume that places like North Korea are actually utopias. It's really quite fascinating.
They're really not. They are really not.
Believe that because the West is corrupt, then the East must not be corrupt. It's really dumb. A little bit funny, to be honest, but also kind of sad. Which, speaking of things that are funny and sad, one really funny cope, just for a break here, just a slightly less serious cope, is that some of the plebit commies will engage in that typical silliness where they try to say, oh, well, there's a difference between socialism and communism, but not really. And these people will then say, oh, well, China isn't communist, but they will be communist in the future. Like this picture right here. None of these societies were communist. They were socialists and trying to achieve communism in the future. As if it freaking matters. It doesn't. Yeah, it really doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
This is such a silly cope whenever they do this. Oh, well, it wasn't a communist failure because they didn't actually achieve communism. Imagine making this argument for any other failed idea. Oh, well, you can't say that our rocket that we designed for going into space didn't work because it's technically not a spaceship unless it actually makes it into outer space. And so because our rocket exploded, it can't be considered a spaceship, and therefore you can't call it a failed spaceship. Our design can only be considered a failure if it actually makes it into outer space. Otherwise, it's not a spaceship. No, seriously, that's how these people sound. To any socialists and communists out there, any tankies out there, I just want you to know, this is how you sound to any rational person when you make arguments like this. Pure 100% unfiltered cope. Most of their arguments really do just kind of boil down to the fact that the CCP still calls itself a communist party, while deliberately ignoring what the party actually does to change its ship around. Which is funny, because communists do tend to get really pedantic over the definition of communism. Except for, of course, the instance of China. In some ways, all you really have to do in order to refute all of these bad takes is to just point that out. I could go into all the silly and wrong things that Hinkle has stated about China, but in this case, I don't really have to, because the post right below what he said does it for me. Ah yes, China, home to a massive state apparatus and the second highest number of billionaires on Earth. Truly the perfect proof that communism, a moneyless, classless, stateless society, work. Wait, and really, in some ways, that's kind of all you have to say. Communists are so obsessed with defining communism as just that, and saying that unless it was a moneyless, classless, stateless, magical utopia prancing unicorns post-scarcity society, then you can't say that it was communism and can't say it didn't work. Unless, of course, if we're talking about whether or not the CCP's policies in the last 40 years or so were communist or not. Then all of a sudden, by some mysterious force, the commies drop that line from their argumentation. It's really a mystery. I just can't put my finger on why they would do this.
I mean, they're just, well, I can. They're doing all of this because it's, in their eyes, ends justify the means, and whatever it takes to win, even if it's just an argument on Twitter or on Reddit. Whatever it takes to win. They will do anything to win. And they're not going to let something like principles or morals or honesty or dealing in good faith get in the way of winning.
Another thing that people don't consider is the Chinese people themselves. For example, in GDP per capita, China is still lagging behind. 13.6k in nominal GDP per capita, or about 29k if we're going by the PPP method, which does, suggest that they're catching up. But what people don't really also consider here is Chinese IQ. Now, there's arguments that Chinese IQ is inflated due to various reasons, but most likely it's not as inflated as certain people would like to believe. And so there's China sitting at number 5 in average IQ, which is interesting considering their GDP. This makes China the only country in the top 5 in general intelligence scores that has a GDP per capita below 50k. And from this data, we actually see the biggest tell that claiming China is successful communism.
I mean, they could be just cheating on examinations. That is always a possibility.
Is in fact nothing more than pure unfiltered cope. Because number 4 on that list is Hong Kong, and number 2 is Taiwan. That's very interesting, isn't it? Because the thing is, at least from a demographics perspective, Hong Kong and Taiwan are both effectively still Chinese. The main difference, though, at least in modern history, is that people from China fled to these places after the CCP gained power. And while there's a lot more to their history, the TLDR is that these two places ended up with Chinese people running under significantly more capitalist policies, which means that it's actually just objective, obvious proof that the CCP is unnecessary. It's effectively proof that any Chinese people's success, whether in China or outside China, is in spite of the Chinese Communist Party, not because of anything done by the Chinese Communist Party, which sadly may explain why the CCP engages in repression of the people of Hong Kong and Taiwan so much, because the CCP probably realizes that their existence and their success is proof to the rest of China that nobody needs the CCP. Whenever the China...
Oh, yeah. No, and it's the same way, even with large cities like Shanghai, there's a certain hatred of the city of Shanghai and the people there because they're, seen as different. Almost like the way New Yorkers or Angelenos in America, or people from London, are seen as out of touch from the rest of whatever country they happen to be in. New Yorkers and Angelenos out of touch with Americans in the heartland, and Londoners out of touch with people in, say, the North, for example.
Chinese Communist Party
Many
tries
such
to get
cases.
in people's way and interfere with the voluntary exchange of goods and services and interfere with the market. They have always made it worse, every single time. And so while it is true that China has gained some success in the recent few decades or so, none of that is from the CCP. And so the history of communism in China is therefore a history of humiliation, failure, and of course 100% pure cope. Anyways, that is all I have to say on this matter. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or again by checking out today's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Thanks again for watching. Till next time.
Yeah, if recent news has been any indicator, chat, you need to get yourself a VPN. Get yourself a VPN. Anyways, there's a link to the video. Give it a like, give it a watch.